Why was she even looking at that board? That was the question running through my head the moment my sister tilted her chin, her eyes narrowing at the names carved into the Navy SEALs obstacle course record wall. It wasn't curiosity in her expression. It wasn't awe. It was calculation, like she was dissecting each number, each time, each name. And then, quietly, almost too softly to hear over the chatter of tourists and the pounding surf behind us, she said 4 words I'll never forget. Mind if I try? I swear the world stopped moving. It was Coronado, San Diego, a blistering afternoon where the California sun pressed down like an interrogation lamp. Naval amphibious base stretched out before us, all steel, sand, and sweat, a cathedral of endurance. I'd been there before, lived there before, bled there before, but this time I wasn't in uniform. I wasn't part of the machine. I was just a man on the wrong side of his discharge papers, a man with a limp, showing his civilian sister around Fleet Week's public tour. And Selene was supposed to be just visiting. She looked impossibly small standing there, 5'4", hiking boots, a Denver Broncos t-shirt that clung to her frame. To the crowd around us, she was another curious face, someone snapping pictures, admiring warriors she could never hope to be. Nobody noticed her calloused hands, the faint scars along her knuckles from years spent guiding broken bodies back to wholeness. Nobody but me. And when she said those words, "Mind if I try," something inside me twisted. Because I knew what came with that board. The obstacle course was brutal by design. It wasn't some carnival attraction built to dazzle civilians on tour. It was a weapon in itself, sculpted to strip men to their bones. 30-foot rope climbs reaching into the sky like punishment, walls that loomed like prison barriers, tires heavy enough to swallow the legs of giants, a rope traverse that had snapped the courage of men far stronger than me. And at the top of it all, etched into weathered plywood for every SEAL candidate to fear, was the name and time of Commander Patterson. 2 minutes 14 seconds, 12 years unbeaten. I'd watched men with muscles like coiled steel crumble at 2:30. I'd seen marathoners, swimmers, iron lifters, all fail to come close. That record had become a kind of ghost story among us. Iron Mike Patterson, the man who'd set a mark so perfect, so clean, that no one dared dream of surpassing it. Selene wasn't looking at it like a tourist, though. She wasn't starstruck. She wasn't intimidated. She was studying it, breaking it down the way she broke down the gait of an amputee patient learning to walk again. The same clinical precision, the same quiet fire. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to shake her, tell her it wasn't a game, tell her this wasn't her world. But I didn't. Because part of me, the part still limping from the ankle that had ended my career, wondered if she was seeing something I couldn't anymore. She was the one who flew out from Denver to be with me that week. The one who saw me not as a broken warrior but as her brother. She'd never been on a military base before. And here she was, in the middle of Fleet Week, surrounded by legends, whispering a challenge to the ghosts of Coronado. Mind if I try? I thought of our father, a Marine built from iron and discipline. He used to tell me I had the strength and Selene had the heart. At Christmas dinners, he'd still cut her steak. At airports, he'd grab her suitcase before she could reach for it. Mom treated her the same. So did I, always shielding, always protecting, like she was made of glass. But maybe we'd been wrong. Because while I was chasing deployments, she was chasing broken veterans through hallways of rehab centers. While I measured my worth in confirmed times and target scores, she was teaching men with shattered spines to believe in their legs again. She didn't wear a trident. She didn't need to. She carried wars of her own, quiet ones, relentless ones. Still, she couldn't possibly think. A whistle cut through my thoughts. The crowd gathered tighter around the course. Master Chief Rodriguez barked for attention, his voice thunder over the sand. He explained the record, the failures, the impossible odds. He gestured at 3 SEALs who would demonstrate. The first, Petty Officer Johnson, hit the rope with raw fury. He climbed like a storm, but the course chewed him up and spit him out. 2 minutes 52. Applause. Respectful but hollow. The second Davis moved sharp, efficient like a machine. Still 241. The third Chief Martinez looked like he could deadlift a car. He powered through with brute force, lungs roaring, 238. And every man left the field shaking his head, staring at the untouchable name on that board. The crowd clapped, phones flashed, children pointed in awe, and beside me Selene tilted her head, narrowing her eyes. "Devin," she whispered, "they're fighting it wrong." I turned. What? They're burning themselves out. It's not about force, it's about flow. Nobody's moving with it, they're moving against it. Her voice was low, calm, too calm. And then she did something that made my stomach drop. She raised her hand. "Master Chief," she said, steady as a blade, "mind if I try?" The silence was a living thing. People froze mid-cheer, mid-sentence. You could hear the gulls crying above us, the surf crashing, the tick of Rodriguez's stopwatch cooling in his palm. He turned slowly, scanning the crowd. His eyes landed on her. He frowned. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, what did you just say?" "I asked if I could attempt the course." I felt the heat drain from my face. I wanted to drag her back, wanted to explain she didn't understand. But she wasn't joking. She wasn't flinching. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, observing from the sidelines, stepped forward with a smirk. "Miss, this isn't American Ninja Warrior. This is a combat course. Trained operators can't beat it. I suggest the junior track for civilians." The crowd chuckled, nervous, dismissive. Acid burned in my stomach. But Selene didn't move. She didn't shrink. Her gaze stayed on the course, on the rope, on the walls, on the board. "I'm not asking to join the SEALs," she said quietly. "I'm asking for one attempt at an obstacle course. I think I can beat that record." And right then, watching her, my hands trembled. Because the way she said it, it didn't sound like a boast. It sounded like a promise. What kind of woman raises her hand in front of a crowd of warriors and dares to claim she can beat them at their own trial? That was the question on everyone's face. You could feel the ripple of disbelief spreading through the group, like a shockwave. Somebody laughed under their breath. Another muttered something about tourists. A young sailor whispered too loudly, "She's kidding, right?" But Selene didn't flinch. Her posture didn't beg for permission. It didn't bend under the weight of ridicule. She just stood there, eyes locked on the course, waiting for an answer. Rodriguez studied her. His weathered face was carved from decades of training elite fighters, his silence heavier than any laugh. Finally, he asked again, as if to test the seriousness of her words. "You want to attempt the Coronado obstacle course, the real one?" "Yes, Master Chief," she replied. "One attempt, that's all I ask." Lieutenant Commander Hayes stepped closer, his arms crossed tight, his smile the kind men wear when they believe they're humoring a child. "Doctor, you understand what you're asking. This course has broken seasoned operators, 12 years untouched. You're what? A physical therapist." The way he said it, dripping with condescension, stung worse than any insult. A physical therapist. As if the title meant she belonged behind a desk, not before a wall. "I specialize in combat injury rehabilitation," Selene said evenly. Hayes didn't blink. "And how does that prepare you for this?" I'd heard this tone before. On football fields when she wanted to play but wasn't tall enough. In high school gymnasiums when coaches cut her for being too small. At family gatherings when Dad lifted her suitcase out of her hands before she even had the chance to prove she could carry it. Her entire life, people had told her she wasn't enough. And her entire life, she'd answered by quietly working harder than anyone else. But now, with all eyes on her, she didn't step back. She stepped forward. "Master Chief," she said firmly, addressing Rodriguez instead of Hayes, "I'm not asking for an exception. I'm asking for a chance." A murmur moved through the crowd again, disbelief turning into discomfort. They wanted her to laugh, to say she was joking, to slip back into the role they'd already written for her. But she didn't. She couldn't. And then from the back, a gravelly voice broke the tension. "Doc Hartwell, is that you?" Heads turned. Out of the throng stepped Chief Bosun's mate Tors, scars cutting across his forearms, salt and pepper hair cropped short, his presence commanding without effort. Selene's eyes lit with recognition. "Chief Tors," she said warmly, "how's the shoulder?" He rotated it like a man testing a miracle. "Feels like $1,000,000, thanks to you." The SEALs nearby shifted, confused. Tors continued, his voice carrying. "Boys, half my platoon's walking today because of this woman. She's the reason Sergeant Martinez runs again. She rebuilt my rotator cuff when 3 doctors told me I'd never lift a pack. If Doc Hartwell wants to run this course, she's earned the right." Rodriguez raised his chin, studying her anew. Hayes bristled, clearly annoyed that his dismissal hadn't been the final word. "Respectfully, Chief," Hayes cut in, "rehabilitation isn't the same as breaking records." "No," Tors said calmly, "but she knows the body better than anyone here. Sometimes that's more dangerous than muscle." The weight of his words silenced the smirks. Selene walked closer to the starting line, scanning the obstacles again, her eyes sharp, calculating. Her lips moved slightly, as though she were rehearsing strategies under her breath. She studied the rope climb, the tires, the traverse, her movements deliberate, clinical. "You're all approaching this wrong," she said suddenly, her voice carrying enough to stop nearby conversations. "You're fighting the course instead of flowing with it. Strength isn't about brute force, it's about efficiency. You're wasting energy where it should be conserved." For a moment no one spoke. Then I saw something shift in Rodriguez's expression. He'd spent decades watching men conquer and fail. And here was this woman, small, unassuming, explaining the very flaw he'd seen break operators for years. Still, doubt lingered heavy. "You really believe you can do it?" Rodriguez asked quietly. Selene met his gaze without hesitation. "I don't just believe it, Master Chief. I know it." That's when my chest tightened. Because the way she said it, steady, calm, almost clinical, it wasn't arrogance. It wasn't bravado, it was truth. Rodriguez glanced at Tors. Tors nodded. The Master Chief sighed, as if calculating both the risk and the history of the moment. Finally, he barked. "All right, safety protocols in place. Medical waiver signed. 1 attempt, understand?" "Yes, Master Chief." The crowd erupted, half with cheers, half with disbelief. Phones came out. Whispers turned to speculation. But for me, it wasn't noise. It was thunder, because deep inside, fear gnawed at me. Not fear of her failing, that would almost be easier, but fear of what would happen if she didn't. You see, I'd built my entire identity on strength, on being the protector, the warrior, the one who carried burdens so she never had to. If she beat that record, if she did the impossible, what would that make me? The thought burned in my chest. Shame, pride, love, fear, a storm I couldn't name. Selene shrugged off her jacket, revealing arms lean but defined. Not bulky, not cut like the seals around us, but honed, precise, every line earned from years of demonstration in her clinic. Hayes muttered something under his breath. A few SEALs exchanged skeptical glances, but others, the ones who'd limped into her Denver clinic and walked out running, watched with something else in their eyes. Respect. Rodriguez raised the stopwatch, his voice like gravel over steel. "Dr. Hartwell, on my mark, but remember this course doesn't just test muscle, it tests everything." Selene stretched her shoulders, rolling her neck, exhaling steady. Then she nodded. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." I wanted to stop her. God, I wanted to stop her, but something in her face told me the time for protection was over. And so, as the sun scorched the sand and the crowd pressed in, we waited. Rodriguez's finger hovered above the timer. 3, 2, 1. What happens in the space between one breath and the next? Sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it's history. Rodriguez's hand dropped. Go. Selene moved. No hesitation, no pause, no glance at the crowd. She exploded forward, and in that instant I swear the air itself shifted. The chatter died. The laughter cut short. Even the gulls overhead seemed to freeze, as though the sky itself leaned closer to watch. The 30-foot rope climb loomed before her. For most men, it was a brute trial of biceps and lungs. But Selene didn't climb like them. She launched upward, her legs gripping, her feet anchoring, her arms pulling with rhythm instead of rage. Her body moved like a system, each muscle working in harmony. By the time she reached the top, barely 12 seconds had passed. Martinez, the strongest of the earlier runners, had needed nearly 30. The crowd gasped. She's flying. I couldn't speak. My jaw clenched, hands digging into my pockets, heart pounding so loud I thought it might drown the surf. She slid down with controlled speed, landing soft on the sand, already pivoting toward the tires. Each weighed heavy enough to buckle a lesser frame. I remembered watching recruits strain, shoulders screaming, veins bulging, as they flipped one after another. Selene didn't fight them. She flowed with them. A push here, a roll there, momentum carrying her forward like water finding its current. Where the seals had lost seconds with each exhausted shove, she strung them together into a rhythm, rolling, stepping, rolling, stepping. She cleared the sequence in less than half the time. "Holy hell," someone whispered. I wanted to cheer, but I couldn't. My throat was locked. Because every obstacle she conquered only deepened the storm inside me. Pride swelled, yes, but so did fear. What if she proved them all wrong? What if she proved me wrong? The wall came next, 12 feet of concrete towering like judgment. Most men ran up, slammed into it, clawed their way to the top, arms burning. Selene sprinted, her feet barely touching sand. At the last moment she launched, momentum carrying her higher than seemed possible for her size. She caught the ledge, swung her leg and vaulted over in one fluid motion. The same wall that slowed every man before her became her springboard. The cheers rose now louder, rower. No nervous chuckles, no polite applause, real guttural shouts. Some of the SEALs who'd smirked minutes earlier leaned forward, eyes wide, phones lifted to record. And still she moved. The rope traverse stretched across the sand like a trap, 30 feet suspended above the ground. 2 of the earlier runners had failed here, their arms seizing mid-cross, their bodies dropping hard. Selene leapt, gripped, and began to glide. That's the only word for it, glide. Her movements were small, controlled, economical. Every technique I'd seen her teach patience. Injured men learning to trust broken shoulders, veterans rebuilding strength. She now unleashed at full speed. Her body never jerked, never faltered. Hand over hand, leg locked over rope, her weight perfectly balanced. She crossed it like silk drawn through fingers. "Look at her pace," Rodriguez muttered, eyes never leaving the stopwatch. "She's ahead," Torres said, his voice fierce with pride. The crowd was shouting now, people on their feet, tourists turned believers in the span of 90 seconds. But for me, it was no longer about the crowd. It was about her, my sister, my fragile sister. The one I'd carried groceries for, the one Dad had cut steak for, the one I thought needed protecting. And here she was, flying. By the time she hit the cargo net, whispers had turned into roars. That net always the time killer, always the soul breaker. Thick rope, loose tension, swaying under the weight of each climber. Even seasoned operators lost precious seconds as their boots snagged, their hands fumbled. Selene didn't stumble, she danced. Every placement of her hands, every thrust of her feet was calculated, precise, efficient. She moved like gravity had agreed to let her borrow a little freedom. And suddenly, too soon, too impossibly soon, she was at the top. She swung down the far side with gymnastic ease, feet hitting sand in perfect stride. And then she was sprinting. The finish line rushed toward her. Rodriguez's finger hovered over the stopwatch button, his lips moving as though he didn't trust his own count. Hayes, once smirking, now stood frozen, his mouth half open. Torres grinned like he was watching his daughter graduate, pride written in every line of his scarred face. The crowd screamed, "Go, go, go!" I couldn't breathe. She crossed. Rodriguez's thumb slammed down. The stopwatch beeped. Selene bent, hands on her knees, chest heaving, sweat gleaming across her forehead. But she didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at Rodriguez, didn't look at me. She looked at the board. 2 minutes, 8 seconds, Rodriguez whispered, staring at the numbers. The silence lasted 1 heartbeat. Then he said it again, louder, 2 minutes, 8 seconds. The words cracked like thunder. The crowd erupted. 12 years of myth shattered in 6 seconds. Phones shot skyward. Tourists screamed. SEALs who doubted her a minute ago now rushed forward, some clapping, some laughing in disbelief, some shaking their heads as though they'd just seen the impossible. Rodriguez lowered the stopwatch, his eyes never leaving Selene. Slowly, almost reverently, he said it one last time. "The record is broken." I felt something inside me break too. Not in despair, not in shame, but in the collapse of an illusion I hadn't realized I was clinging to. Because all my life I thought strength was mine to carry, that I had to shield her, protect her, that she was fragile glass and I was steel. But steel bends, steel breaks. Glass, when tempered by fire, becomes unshatterable. And in that moment, watching my sister stand tall under the roar of Coronado, I knew the truth. She had never been the one needing protection. She had been the protector all along. What do you do when the impossible has already happened? That was the question hanging in the hot California air as my sister stood at the finish line, chest heaving, sweat tracing lines down her temples. The stopwatch still glowed in Rodriguez's calloused hand, its numbers cold, unarguable. 2 minutes and 8 seconds. The sound that followed wasn't just applause, it was chaos. Tourists screamed as though they'd witnessed a miracle. Sailors who had been smirking minutes ago now clapped until their palms turned red. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, pointing with wide eyes. Even some of the active SEALs, men carved from stone, forged in fire, were grinning like kids at a fireworks show. But Selene didn't raise her arms in triumph. She didn't pose for the cameras now flashing like lightning. She simply straightened, wiped sweat from her brow, and stared at the record board again. 12 years erased in 6 seconds. Rodriguez stepped forward, slow, deliberate. The crowd quieted instinctively. His boots crunched the sand as he stopped before her, extending his hand. "Dr. Hartwell," he said, voice rough but steady. "In 23 years of service, I've never seen anything like that." Selene took his hand, shaking it with calm humility. "Thank you, Master Chief." "Would you mind," he asked, almost cautiously, "if we logged your technique for training analysis? What you did out there, it wasn't brute strength. It was something else, something we can learn from." Her lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Of course, I'd be honored." Behind him, Hayes stood stiff, arms crossed, his smirk long gone. For a moment I thought he'd stay silent, pride swallowing the apology he owed. But then he stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Dr. Hartwell," he said, his voice low, "I misjudged you. That was extraordinary. What you accomplished here will be remembered for years." The words were grudging, but real. Selene nodded politely. "Thank you, Commander." He looked as though he wanted to say more, then stopped, the weight of the crowd's eyes pressing down. Torres clapped his hands together, his grin wide enough to break stone. "Doc, you just became a Coronado legend. Mark my words, 10 years from now, some hotshot kid will look up at that board and will tell him about the day Dr. Selene Hartwell rewrote history." The cheers roared again, raw and thunderous. But through it all, Selene's eyes searched until they found mine. She walked over, her steps steady despite the exhaustion still catching in her breath. When she reached me, her hand landed on my shoulder with the same gentle strength I'd watched guide veterans through years of recovery. "Devon," she whispered, "why are you crying?" I hadn't even realized the tears had broken loose. I tried to laugh, but the sound cracked. "Nothing's wrong," I said, my voice shaking. "Everything's right. Selene, I've been such an idiot." Her brow furrowed softly. "All these years," I continued, "I thought I had to protect you, shield you, carry the weight for you. I never realized you never needed protecting. You were stronger than I ever knew." Her eyes softened, shimmering in the sunlight. "Devon," she said, her voice calm, almost a whisper, "I didn't break this record to prove anything to the SEALs, or to you. I broke it to prove something to myself. And maybe to show people who have been told their whole lives they're not enough, that strength doesn't always look the way we expect." I swallowed hard, fighting the knot in my throat. Behind us, the crowd still buzzed, laughter and disbelief spilling like waves. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The noise faded. The cameras disappeared. It was just me and my sister, my fragile sister who had just shattered a legend. And yet she didn't look triumphant. She looked relieved. As though the record wasn't the real obstacle. As though the real barrier had been something she carried inside herself for 28 years. Rodriguez approached again, his expression grave but warm. "Doctor, I don't say this lightly. You've given us something valuable today, not just a record, a lesson. These men," he gestured at the SEALs still murmuring in disbelief, "have built their lives on power, but you showed them efficiency, precision, resilience. That matters, more than they realize." Selene inclined her head. "That's the only way I know how to work. My patients taught me that." Rodriguez nodded once, respect carved deep into his lined face. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the sand. Fleet Week visitors began to drift, still buzzing, still glancing back at the course as though it might vanish into myth the moment they turned away. Selene stayed quiet, her breathing even now, her hands loose at her sides. She hadn't celebrated. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't once acted like the hero of the story unfolding around her. And that, more than anything, silenced me. Because for years I thought strength was loud, flashy, shouting orders, lifting more weight, standing taller than the rest. But my sister's strength was silent, patient, precise. The kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, it just acts. As the crowd thinned, Hayes stepped close again. His expression was almost conflicted. "Dr. Hartwell," he said, "what you did, it's going to ripple. Whether you meant to or not, you've changed the way people see this course, changed the way they see limits." Selene glanced at him, her face unreadable. "Limits," she murmured. "Funny thing about them. Most are illusions. The body's not the only thing that breaks under pressure. Sometimes it's the story we tell ourselves about what we can't do." Hayes looked at her a long moment, then nodded, conceding something silently. Torres clapped me on the back, nearly knocking the breath from my lungs. "You proud of her, Hartwell?" I tried to answer, but the words tangled. Proud didn't touch it. I was undone. I'd spent my whole life carrying a shield around her, never realizing she'd forged her own blade in silence. When we finally left the training area, the sun nearly set, Selene walked beside me without a word. She didn't need to speak. Her presence was enough. But inside me, everything churned. Because now, with my discharge papers still heavy in my pocket, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in months. Hope. Hope that maybe my service wasn't over. That maybe, like her, I could still find a way to matter. And yet beneath that flicker of light, another thought lingered, a question I couldn't shake. Had we underestimated her for so long, or had she allowed us to, because proving herself wasn't about us at all? 6 months later, her name still sat at the top of the board. Selene Hartwell, 2 minutes 8 seconds. Every time I thought the glow around that moment might fade, it didn't. Tourists still stopped to stare. Recruits still whispered about it. And active SEALs, men who'd once laughed at her audacity, were now studying her run on playback like it was sacred text. I knew because I saw it myself. I went back to Coronado one crisp morning in January, when the fog rolled in from the Pacific like a shroud. I stood behind the fence, half hidden, watching a group of trainees huddle around a projector screen as instructors dissected her every move. "See her feet," Rodriguez's gravelly voice carried over the mist. "She uses momentum, not muscle. It's conservation. You burn less, you gain more." The men nodded, scribbling notes, eyes narrowed in focus. It felt surreal. My sister, fragile sister, was now teaching warriors through the echo of her run. And the thing that struck me most, she wasn't even there to bask in it. Selene hadn't paraded her victory. She hadn't done interviews, hadn't chased headlines. When the Navy asked her to consult, she agreed quietly, showing up in the same hiking boots and calm demeanor. She walked the course with instructors, pointing out biomechanics, demonstrating efficiencies. And then she flew back to Denver, returning to her patients. Her clinic was her battlefield. That hadn't changed. But something had changed in me. When I first watched her shatter Patterson's record, I thought the world had tilted. That somehow, in a single afternoon, everything I believed about her, and about myself, collapsed. But what really happened was simpler. I saw clearly for the first time. For months I'd struggled in silence. My medical discharge still sat on my kitchen counter, a document that felt like both a death sentence and a betrayal. 8 years of service. Done. My body, my ankle, had decided my fate. And every morning when I tried to jog and the limp reminded me of what I'd lost, I thought I was finished. But Selene didn't let me rot in that silence. She called every week, sometimes every day, not with pep talks, not with pity, but with questions. "How's the ankle today? Did you try the new stretch? Have you thought about helping out at the VA?" At first, I brushed her off. Then one afternoon, when the walls of my apartment felt like they were pressing in, I went. The VA hospital was loud, chaotic, full of men and women trying to claw their way back to normal after service. Some missing legs, some missing memories, some just missing hope. And for the first time since my discharge, I felt something shift. I wasn't a SEAL anymore, but I knew the language, I knew the looks in their eyes, the quiet shame of weakness, the bitterness of being left behind. I'd felt it too. So I stayed. I started volunteering, started coaching, guiding, listening, started becoming the man I thought I'd lost. And all the while, Selene kept doing what she'd always done, building people back piece by piece without fanfare, without needing anyone's approval. But her record, the one she broke that summer day, kept rippling outward. Instructors invited her back for a symposium on training methodologies. She stood in front of rooms full of officers and specialists, explaining biomechanics in plain, steady words. Some frowned, some questioned, but none dismissed her. Because when they doubted, all she had to do was point to the board. 2 minutes, 8 seconds. She never bragged, never told stories about the moment. In fact, she avoided talking about it unless pressed. When people asked why she'd done it, her answer was always the same: to prove to myself I could. But I knew it was more. I knew it was for every kid told they were too small, for every patient limping into her clinic convinced their life was over, for every brother who thought his sister needed protecting when, in truth, she was the strongest one in the room. The last time I visited her in Denver, I found her at the clinic, kneeling beside a double amputee Marine who was learning to balance on new prosthetics. Her voice was calm, steady, encouraging. The same voice she'd used on me, the same voice she'd carried across the obstacle course that day. "Small steps," she said softly. "Efficiency first, power comes later." The Marine wobbled, teeth gritted, sweat dripping down his forehead. Selene steadied him, her hands sure, her presence anchoring. And when he finally took 2 clean steps without stumbling, his eyes filled with tears. Selene just smiled. "See, stronger than you thought." Later, over coffee, I asked her if she ever thought about that day at Coronado. She sipped, shrugged lightly. "Sometimes, but not the way people expect." "What do you mean?" "I don't replay the record, I replay the silence before it. That moment when everyone thought I was ridiculous for asking. That's the moment that mattered. That's when I proved something, not the stopwatch, not the board, the choice to say, 'Mind if I try.'" Her words sank deep, heavier than any metal. Because she was right. The real strength wasn't the sprint. It was the decision to step forward in the face of ridicule, in the face of doubt, and refuse to shrink. That was the record she truly broke. And in the months that followed, I realized something else. Maybe my discharge wasn't the end of my service. Maybe it was the beginning of another kind. Just as Selene showed the SEALs that strength could mean efficiency, she showed me that service could mean more than combat. It could mean standing beside the broken, lifting them piece by piece, reminding them that limits are often illusions. I wasn't done, neither of us were. And on nights when I lay awake, ankle throbbing with phantom pain, I'd hear her voice again. Calm, steady, a whisper in the silence. "Mind if I try?" Why does a single act echo louder than a lifetime of routine? That's the question I kept asking myself as months slipped into seasons. And still, her run refused to fade into memory. You'd think it would. After all, the world is quick to move on. Records are broken, stories go viral, then they vanish. But not this one, not hers. At Coronado, the board became something more than a marker of time. It became a reminder, a test, a whisper to every man who walked past it. "She did it. What's your excuse?" I watched the culture shift with my own eyes. Before, the course had been a brute's playground. Men attacked it with ferocity, slamming their bodies against walls, ripping their palms open on ropes, collapsing in sand with lungs on fire. They measured success in scars, failure in seconds too slow. After Selene, everything changed. Rodriguez himself began altering how he taught. Efficiency drills, flow exercises. He'd point at the board and recruits would nod, their pride prickling under the weight of her ghost. The stopwatch didn't care about your biceps. The board didn't care about your swagger. Only precision mattered now. Instructors called it the Hartwell effect. I'll never forget the first time I overheard a young trainee groan after failing to cut his time down. His instructor snapped, "Don't fight the course, work with it. Ask yourself, what would Hartwell do?" It stunned me. A phrase like that, born from my sister's quiet defiance, now guiding the next generation of SEALs. And yet Selene never mentioned it. When I asked if she'd heard about her influence, she only shrugged. "It's not about me, it's about the work." But that was Selene. She didn't carry victories like trophies. She carried them like tools, quiet, necessary, never flashy. The truth was, her strength had always been this way. Subtle, patient, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, and for years I hadn't been. I thought about our childhood, how she'd sit in the living room with anatomy books while I trained in the backyard. How she'd watch our father patch up his old Marine buddies after long weekends, absorbing everything in silence. How she'd show up at my football games not to cheer, but to study the players who limped off-field, already thinking of how to fix them. I thought she was fragile because she didn't shout about her fire, but maybe true strength doesn't shout. Maybe it whispers and waits until the moment it's needed most. That day at Coronado wasn't about breaking a record. It was about revealing what had always been there. For me, the aftermath was both humbling and liberating. I started working more with veterans at the VA, guiding them through drills, helping them push against walls they thought were immovable. And every time a man said, "I can't," I thought of Selene on that sunlit course. I'd tell them, "Maybe you can't yet, But what if you tried differently? And when their eyes flickered with doubt, I'd add softly, my sister taught me that. They didn't always understand, but I did, and that was enough. One evening, Rodriguez called me. His gravelly voice came through the line like sandpaper. Your sister's still ahead of us, he said. What do you mean? We've had 30 men attempt since her run. Closest anyone's come is 214 flat. Exactly Patterson's old mark. She's still out in front. I laughed in disbelief. So you're saying? I'm saying we've got men with bigger muscles, faster sprints, more training, and none of them can beat a physical therapist from Denver. That ought to tell you something, Hartwell. It did. It told me that records weren't just numbers. They were stories, and her story had carved itself into the bones of that base. But what struck me most wasn't that she'd beaten men stronger than her. It was that she'd beaten the idea that she wasn't supposed to. That idea had haunted her all her life. Too small, too quiet, too soft. The world never said it cruelly, but it said it often, and sometimes that's worse, because kindness can build cages too. But she'd shattered that cage with 6 seconds to spare. And me, I was still learning from it. There were nights when I sat alone, staring at my discharge papers, the bitterness rising like bile, and I'd hear her voice in my head, calm, steady. That moment when she stood before a crowd that doubted her and said, "Mind if I try?" I realized that maybe I could ask the same. Mind if I try to serve differently? Mind if I try to heal instead of fight? Mind if I try to stop seeing myself as broken? Because if Selene had taught me anything, it was this: dignity doesn't demand, it doesn't roar, it simply acts. And as I worked beside her, sometimes in Denver, sometimes at the VA, I began to understand the depth of her strength. She didn't just heal bodies, she healed shame. She healed the story people told themselves about their limits. That was the real record. One evening, long after the world had stopped buzzing about her run, I asked her if she'd ever go back to Coronado and try again. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. I don't need to, once was enough. Records aren't about repeating, they're about proving possibility. Her words lingered. Because in truth, it wasn't just SEALs who needed that possibility. It was me. It was every veteran limping out of the service with a heart heavier than their gear. It was every person who'd been told they were too weak, too small, too fragile. Her run belonged to all of us. And in quiet moments when I thought about the board at Coronado, the name etched at the top, untouched for 6 months and counting, I felt something like peace. Because I finally understood. Strength isn't loud. Strength isn't muscle. Strength isn't always what the world claps for. Sometimes strength is a woman in hiking boots, standing before a crowd of doubters and saying softly, "Mind if I try?" How do you rebuild a life when the foundation is gone? That was the question that haunted me every morning I woke up after my discharge. Before, my days had been mapped in discipline, training schedules, mission briefs, deployments. I knew who I was, where I belonged. But after the ankle, after the papers, there was only silence. No orders, no team, just me and the ache in my bones. For months I convinced myself I was finished. I told myself I'd peaked, that my worth had been left bleeding somewhere on a training field. But Selene's record-breaking run cracked something open inside me. It was as though her voice, her defiance, her precision, had reached into the pit I was drowning in and said, "Try again. Differently this time." So I did. The VA became my new battlefield. At first I stood awkwardly in the hallways, unsure if I belonged. Men wheeled past me, some missing limbs, others missing hope. The air smelled of antiseptic and weariness. I thought they'd see me as another washed-out vet. But then one of them, a young Marine missing half his right leg, looked at my limp and asked, "You too?" The question hit hard, not an insult, a connection. "Yes," I said quietly, "me too." That was the beginning. Over time, I started helping out during physical therapy sessions, spotting men during lifts, timing their laps, offering quiet encouragement when their shoulders sagged under the weight of defeat. At first, it felt small, almost meaningless. But then I saw the way their eyes shifted when I didn't pity them, didn't coddle them, just stood beside them like a teammate. And I realized that was the service I still had to give. Selene, of course, knew this before I did. One evening, after a long day at the VA, we sat in her kitchen in Denver. She poured tea, her hands steady, her expression calm as always. "You found it," she said softly. "Found what?" "Your place. It's not where you thought it would be, but it's yours." I leaned back, the steam rising between us. "Funny. I thought you needed me to protect you. Turns out I needed you to remind me I wasn't finished." Her eyes warmed, but she didn't gloat. She never gloat. "We protect each other, Dev. That's what family is." Silence settled between us, comfortable, heavy with truth. And yet, the ripples of her act weren't just touching me. At the clinic, I saw patients who had once stared at the floor with dead eyes now ask about that doctor who broke the Navy record. Veterans who had given up on their bodies suddenly wanted to try again. "If she can do that," they'd say, "maybe I can take one more step." Her story wasn't hers anymore. It had become theirs. And I watched as the legend spread in quiet ways. One day at the VA, I overheard a therapist telling a patient, "Don't muscle through it, flow with it. That's how Dr. Hartwell teaches it." Another time, a recruit, barely 19, nervous as a rabbit, recognized me when I limped into the gym. His eyes widened. "You're her brother, aren't you? The one who watched her run?" I nodded, surprised. He grinned nervously. "They showed us the video at training. I've been trying to run it like her. I can't get close, but it's different. It feels possible." Possible. That word stuck with me. Because possibility is a dangerous thing. It rewrites limits. It refuses to let you settle. It whispers that maybe, just maybe, the story you've told yourself about who you are isn't the full story. And that was Selene's true gift. She didn't just break a record, she broke the story. But for all the ripples she caused, she stayed the same. Humble, focused, more interested in her patients' victories than her own. I remember one night, sitting with her on the porch as the Denver sky blazed with stars. I asked her why she never celebrated more, why she never let herself own the glory she'd earned. She sipped her tea, thoughtful. "Because," she said, "records don't define me. They're moments, not identities. What matters is what those moments create for other people." Her words cut deep. Because I realized how differently we'd lived. I'd built my identity around being a SEAL. When that was taken, I was nothing. But Selene, she never let any single label define her. Not fragile, not weak, not even champion. She simply acted and let the ripples speak for themselves. That night I lay awake thinking about the word she'd used, moments. Her run was a moment. My discharge was a moment, but neither told the whole story. The story was what came after. And slowly, painfully, I began to believe that maybe my story wasn't over either. Months later, I was asked to speak to a group of recruits about resilience. Me, a man who had limped out of service. At first I almost said no. What right did I have to talk to them? But then I thought of Selene, raising her hand in front of a crowd of doubters and saying, "Mind if I try?" So I did. I stood before them, my limp obvious, my voice unsteady at first, and I told them the truth about failure, about shame, about the silence that follows when your identity collapses, and about the sister who showed me that strength isn't about never breaking, it's about refusing to stay broken. When I finished, the room was silent, and then one of the recruits, barely more than a kid, raised his hand. "Sir," he asked, "was it really 208? I smiled. "Yes, 208, and I saw it with my own eyes." The room buzzed with awe, and I realized then that her story wasn't fading. It was growing, rooting itself into the next generation. Later, when I told Selene about the talk, she only shook her head, amused. It was never about the numbers, Dev. It was about reminding them to ask the question. What question? She looked at me, her eyes steady, her voice quiet. Mind if I try? And in that moment, I understood. Because that question is more than a request. It's defiance. It's hope. It's the spark that turns silence into possibility. Her question had changed everything. For me, for them, for anyone willing to listen. How long does a single moment last? A record is seconds on a clock, a breath, a heartbeat, and yet somehow her moment refused to fade. 6 months had stretched into nearly a year, and still, her name stood untouched at the top of that weathered board at Coronado. 2 minutes, 8 seconds, the mark no one else could touch. But when I looked at Selene, I knew she'd already let it go. She didn't talk about it. She didn't frame the certificate the Navy sent her. She didn't replay the footage or scroll through the articles that briefly flared across news feeds. She went back to her patients, her clinic, her quiet work. For her, the record was never about recognition. It was about a question. Mind if I try? I didn't understand the weight of those words until much later. Because when she said them, she wasn't just asking to attempt an obstacle course. She was asking the world to stop underestimating her. She was asking me, our parents, the SEALs, the crowd, every voice that ever said too small, too fragile, to stand aside and let her prove what she already knew. And that day, under the California sun, she proved it. But the real legacy wasn't the number on the board. It was what followed. I saw it ripple through training culture. Recruits who used to glorify brute force now talked about efficiency, flow, economy of movement. They studied her run as though it were scripture. Instructors told them, don't fight the course, work with it. I saw it ripple through patients at the VA. Men who once sat in silence, shoulders slumped, began to lift their heads when they heard her story. If she could stand before a crowd of doubters and break a 12-year legend, maybe they could take another step. Maybe they could try one more time. And I saw it ripple through me. Because I had been the loud one, the strong one, the protector, and when my body broke I thought I was nothing. But Selene showed me a different kind of strength. The kind that doesn't roar, the kind that doesn't demand, the kind that simply acts. She reminded me that service doesn't end with a discharge. It just changes. It shifts into something quieter, maybe even harder, the service of lifting others when they can't lift themselves. One evening, almost a year after her run, I found myself back at Coronado. I hadn't planned to be there. I was in town for a conference, but something pulled me to the base, to the place where everything changed. The sun was setting, painting the sky in molten gold. The board still stood, weathered and proud. Her name still gleamed at the top, and below it I saw rows of names scratched out, attempts that had come close but not close enough. 214, 215, 216. But none could touch 208. I stood there for a long time, the wind carrying the scent of salt and sweat, memories pressing in. I remembered her voice in that moment before the run, calm and steady. I think I can beat that record. And she had. Not just the record, not just the course. She had beaten doubt itself. As the shadows stretched long across the sand, I realized something else. It wasn't just her moment, it was mine too, because without her I would still be lost in silence, drowning in the story that I was finished. She showed me a new story, one where service didn't mean being invincible, one where strength wasn't about shielding someone else, it was about standing beside them, even when you were broken too. That night I called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm, familiar. Devon. I went back today, I said quietly. To Coronado, your name's still there. She was silent for a moment, then chuckled softly. For now. For now, I asked. Records are made to be broken, she said. That's the point. Someone will come along, faster, stronger, maybe even smarter. And when they do, it won't erase what I did, because it was never about being the best. It was about proving possible. Her words sank deep, like stones dropping into still water. "Selene," I whispered, "do you even realize what you've done? The way you've changed things?" There was another pause, then her voice came, soft and certain. "Dev, the only thing I wanted to change was myself. Everything else, that's just grace." I closed my eyes, the ocean wind rustling around me, her words anchoring me in a way no metal or trident ever had. And I realized the story wasn't about records or seals or even about me. It was about a woman in hiking boots who asked a question no one expected, and in doing so, gave the rest of us permission to ask it too. "Mind if I try?" That question had become my compass. It had guided veterans through pain, recruits through doubt, me through despair. It had redefined strength in ways no stopwatch ever could. As the last light bled across the horizon, I thought about the legacy of that moment. Someday her record would fall. Time always wins. Someone faster would come, someone stronger. And when they did, they'd see her name scratched out, replaced by another. But even then, her true record would remain untouched. Because records are seconds, but courage, real courage, lasts forever. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need applause or headlines. Sometimes dignity simply acts. And sometimes it whispers 4 quiet words that can change everything. "Mind if I try?"